I'm now excited to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon session, Carla Billon. Carla is a 19-year-old honors student at McGill University whose work sits at the intersection of queer history, disability studies, and contemporary literature. She is currently completing a thesis that reinterprets love and religion in the poetry of Leonard Cohen through a queer theoretical lens, challenging conventional narratives around intimacy and the sacred. She is the recipient of the Dow Hickson Scholarship, awarded in recognition of her academic excellence and research promise. Her wider research examines how literature constructs disability, and she is particularly interested in how reading practices can unsettle inherited assumptions and open up more ethically grounded ways of understanding marginalized identities. Her work invites audiences to reconsider the narratives they take for granted and to imagine literary futures that offer fuller, more capacious spaces for marginalized lives. Please welcome Carla to the stage for her talk, The Cost of Being a Metaphor, What Fiction Gets Wrong About Disability.
Think of the last book you've read. Did it have a disabled character? If it did, don't think you're out of the woods just yet. What role did that character play? Did they have a purpose in the narrative outside of teaching others about disability? Do they get cured or do they die? This is called the Fries test, and you can consider it the disability equivalent to the Bechdel test, designed to evaluate women's representation in fiction. You probably cannot think of a single book that passes this test. And that's okay. If I weren't disabled myself or interested in reading about disability, I don't know that I could either. And that is no accident, because literature is an apparatus, which means it is an ideological machine that surrounds us and influences our beliefs, our systems, our society, and our environment in general. You could argue a lot of canonical literature does represent disability. We have Oedipus, Shakespeare's Richard III, and everyone here remembers Captain Hook. But all these stories have one thing in common. They do not represent disability for the sake of disability. They represent disability as a symbol, a stand-in for something else. That phenomenon is called narrative prosthesis. It is a phenomenon which occurs when literature uses a crutch for the narrative to lean upon to advance the story. And what is incredibly problematic is that in a lot of cases, disability takes that spot. Disability occupies the liminal space in which opposition occurs in a novel or any form of fiction. And this is incredibly problematic for people with disabilities, but for society in general, because it encourages us to devalue people with disabilities and only view disability as a metaphor. This is what gave rise to eugenics in the late 19th and early 20th century, a current which advocated for the improvement of the human race through genetic manipulation. And in this context enters Virginia Woolf, a queer icon, a great feminist writer for her landmark essay, A Room of One's Own. There's another side to Virginia Woolf, a darker side that not a lot of people know about, a side that wrote, "We met and had to pass a long line of imbeciles. It was perfectly horrible. They should certainly be killed." Shocking. Yet, not that much when you look at the context in which Woolf lived. Woolf lived in the bustling streets of London in the 20th century, and as such, was immersed in eugenics discourse. At that time, you could find two forms of eugenics. Negative eugenics, which advocated for the forced sterilization and mass eradication of people with disabilities, and positive eugenics, but don't get fooled by the name, which advocated for the selective reproduction of people who own certain genetic traits, such as white skin, high IQ, or physical ability. At the same time, we all know Virginia Woolf as a great progressive writer. She wrote an essay called On Being Ill, which advocated for more representation of mental illness in literature, and oftentimes her characters are written with great empathy. So how do we make sense of this? How can we reconcile both sides of Virginia Woolf? How come her work often reinforces the same norms it seeks to resist? Let me show you what I mean. Take Mrs. Dalloway, for example, one of her novels. In this book, there's a character called Septimus, a shell-shocked World War I veteran who suffers from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. He is written with astonishing empathy. His mind is fundamentally broken in the eyes of society, yet we enter it through Woolf's narrative. But when we look more closely at the structure of the novel, you will see Septimus is a counterpoint, a foil to Clarissa, the socially acceptable woman, sane, whose parties the novel revolves around. Moreover, Septimus's death is what provides Clarissa with an emotional revelation, a choice to embrace life. The disabled character has to die for the main character's story arc to advance. And that is not an isolated incident. Take The Waves. In this one, a character called Rhoda suffers from dissociative episodes and struggles to anchor herself in time. And she is written, again, with great empathy from Woolf. The passages about her are beautiful, and she's a great representation of what we now call neurodivergence. But Rhoda dies. And not only does Rhoda die, Rhoda kills herself. Rhoda kills herself before society can kill her, simply because she's too fundamentally broken in the eyes of society. She is not enough. And her suicide is barely even a choice. It is a constraint put upon her by society, because she has no way of living in their eyes. Again, the disabled character must die, and in a way is killed by society. And this is, again, just in Virginia Woolf, because what we're doing here is not just looking for villains in the literary canon to then cancel those authors. We are looking for the mechanism that engineered our ableist society today. How come disabled characters always die? How come is there such a gap between what literature seeks to represent, revolution, progress, and what it actually represents? And for me, that gap is not theoretical. I grew up reading books, a lot of books, as you can see. Like, you could not find me without a book in my hand. And yet, all the books I read ended the same way. A return to the normal, the established order, minus maybe a few story arcs here and there. And I didn't think that much of it. And then I encountered an adaptation of the novel by Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And it's a movie that came out in 2010 in which the Mad Hatter said to Alice, "You used to be much more, muchier. You've lost your muchness." And I really liked that quote. And I didn't know why at the time, but it truly spoke to me. And that is simply because I didn't have the language for autism at the time, but it reflected exactly what I felt. 1 minute, we are too muted. The next, we are too much in the eyes of society. We are never quite calibrated to what they want us to be. So when I encountered Woolf, and when I went back on all the books I've read, I realized I didn't grow up lacking representation. I grew up absorbing the wrong kind. In the books I've read, I was taught that my mind was legible, but not livable. And when literature represented disability, it gave it visibility, obviously, but not viability. It represented illness, but never justice. I was taught that I could not exist with a mind like mine. So when I encountered those works by Woolf, I wasn't shocked more than I understood the world around me. I understood how deep cultural judgment values are entangled with literary form. And that is why I'm here today, because I want you to start considering disability in a new lens. Think of disability as a critical lens, much like the way you've been taught to read gender, race, class, not just as character traits, but manifestations of structures of power. Why is disability being represented? Why is it not? Is it invisibilized? How is it represented? Ask those questions of every text you encounter. Because the mechanism that we see in literature and the patterns of making disability tragic or comic and never giving it a happy ending don't just stay on the page. They migrate to classrooms, to politics, to medicine, to all the fields that affect us today. When you look at literature, I want you to consider what you are not looking at. What is on the page, but more importantly, what the blank space on the page represents. Because if the books we read yesterday shape the world in which we live today, what about the books we can write today? Maybe they can change the future, they can change tomorrow for new generations to come and be more inclusive of people with disabilities and autism and every form of neurodivergence and difference that you can encounter in your life. Thank you.
What an intriguing talk, Carla. Thank you so much. I just have one question, though. When readers pick up a book today, what's one question that they should ask themselves to consider in order to identify when disability is doing symbolic work rather than being actively represented?
Thank you, Ben. Well, when you pick up a book, first there has to be a disabled character to ask these questions, which is already a rare occurrence. But when you see them, ask yourself, what is the disability itself doing the work, or is it something about the character that is doing this work? Also, just wonder what disability is being represented. Is it just a token character, much like we see in many movies and fiction in general? Or do they have an actual role in the plot that is not dependent on their physical or mental capacities? That is the main question you need to ask yourselves.
Thank you so much, Carla.
Thank you.
Thank you.